Remember that sequence in the original Shrek movie where Fiona and Shrek like inflate a snake and a frog and they just kind of like float around into the atmosphere? That particular sequence, I don't know, it sits really deep. I just talked about that gingerbread torture sequence where they essentially like chop his legs off. I think that particular sequence or that scene is just as dark and heavy. Like, how am I going to explain to my children whether the frog and the snake ever landed safely back on Earth? Did they just like miserably float around until they passed enough gas to come back safely? Or did they just like become fossilized in the sky? Like, how does that even work? How do I explain that to my children? Sometimes they ask me really weird questions and I have to sit there and try to explain things. They need to stop with the dark jokes, okay? They're very funny for adults, but for children, I don't know, I feel like it's traumatizing them. Anyways, all jokes aside, we're not watching Shrek as a family anymore. Let's get straight into today's video. I actually wanted to talk about something that has been rumbling around my tiny little reptilian brain, and I've honestly covered it, I would say, at least twice in the past, and I'm thinking about potentially deleting those videos because those were like really quick rants. They weren't as in-depth, and in today's video, I kind of want to go a little bit deeper and just give you guys my personal opinion, my personal take on Jada Toys as a whole. And mind you, this is coming from somebody that actually considers them to be potentially like the best manufacturer out in the wild right now, not just because they're like incredibly affordable, but I think if you take into consideration price point and sculpt work, articulation, accessories, and even simple things like packaging and how well designed they are. If you take everything into consideration and just bring it together, I definitely feel like they are the best toy manufacturer out there. There are brief moments where, or like a few weeks here and there, where I do feel like the McFarlane DC line maybe takes over for a little bit, or maybe a Marvel Legends wave just completely obliterates my perspective on the action figure industry as a whole. But I would say more consistently, they're popping up for me. And this is coming from also somebody that doesn't really collect everything that Jada Toy has released up to this point. I have a very small sample size of their particular lines. I've picked up like maybe 3 to 4 different Street Fighter action figures and a couple of different Mega Man action figures. That's it. I haven't really dove too deep into them, but I do plan on circling back around. Sometimes it's just a matter of finding the time and making a little bit of room in your budget to be able to purchase other lines that you're not used to. And so Jada Toys always kind of falls on the further reaches of my budgetary constraints from time to time. But it's really interesting going forward. Like I said, I've already covered this on a couple of different occasions, but today we're going to go a little bit more in depth, because if I'm being completely honest with myself and with everybody watching, I do personally feel like Jada Toys is like essentially running off a cliff at this point. And I don't think it's going to be one of those situations where they like go out of business within the next week or two or even the next month, but I do feel like it's going to be a very slow decline and they're going to circle the drain eventually, just because of the IPs they're working on. Again, this has nothing to do with their quality and their action figures and their engineer work, their articulation scheme, the accessories. All of that is top notch. They're one of the best OMs out there, but this is more of an indictment on the IPs that they're picking up. It just makes absolutely no sense that the best toy manufacturer out there is making cereal mascots. I mean, it's a really cool concept, and I guess nostalgia definitely plays a role here, and it definitely tugs at the heartstrings. But at the end of the day, how many legitimate action figure collectors are picking that particular lineup? I don't think that it's an insane amount. I think it's mostly people that grew up eating the cereal, which I guess is mostly everybody. But most collectors are pretty deep into the lines that they're interested in. If they're collecting Marvel Legends or DC or Star Wars, they usually only tend to stay within those lanes. They'll sometimes veer a little bit if it's something that really interests them, but I just don't feel that there's like a huge demand or a huge fan base for cereal mascots. We have seen, for example, Tony the Tiger recently get released. It came with, a decent amount of articulation. He could get into some pretty crazy poses. Came with a couple of extra accessories, but I just don't see that being an action figure that flies off the shelves or that sells incredibly well, especially for a small manufacturer like that. Count Chocula is also a perfect example of this. He was released a few years ago. And then you have the Fruity Pebbles mascots, who are the Flintstones. Even their most popular mascot, Chester the cheetah, did kind of sell out initially, but then eventually it became widely available. I'm not sure if that's because they're doing it on purpose, like they just want certain items or certain characters to just be widely available on a consistent basis. And we have actually seen that from Jada Toys from time to time. Like something will go out of stock and then they'll just continue restocking it indefinitely. Maybe that's a game plan that they're going for, but we have to remind ourselves they're going up against the giants at this point. They're going up against Hasbro, who has the Marvel Legends series. They also have the Black Series line, as well as Transformers, G.I. Joes. You look at McFarlane, they have the Spawn universe. At the moment, they still have the DC line. Mattel has wrestling, so on and so forth. I mean, these manufacturers have some really big IPs under their belt. And unfortunately, Jada Toys just can't seem to keep up with those particular manufacturers. I'm not sure if that's by design. Do they want to remain kind of a little bit underground and unnoticed, and then eventually they'll make their big move? But consistently you see them picking up IPs that I just don't feel like have the foundation for a long-term line. The Scooby-Doo action figure wave that they just decided to release is another prime example. Scooby-Doo does have a little bit of a following. Most of us grew up watching the animated series, but how much are we really going to invest in a Scooby-Doo line? I think there are a lot of people that are picking these action figures up, but most of them are people that, have that attachment, that grew up watching those shows. And most of those are, people that are much older, in their 30s, 40s, 50s. I don't see a lot of like the newer, younger generation really jumping in on something like that. The Street Fighter line is probably their most successful one, just because it attaches to the Marvel Legends line, or just Marvel action figures in general. We have SH doing Marvel vs. Capcom as well. So honestly, that's probably their best avenue to just continue giving us different versions, different iterations of, particular characters from the Street Fighter universe. We've actually seen them do it pretty consistently. Like they'll give us a Player 2 variant, or a character that is sold like a Big Bad Toy Store exclusive, for example, version from a particular character. So they'll continue to kind of reuse body molds here and there for the most part to try to maximize their profits. But even in that situation, they already have a direct competitor in Storm Collectibles. They just decided to release their version of the Street Fighter characters, and I completely get it. It's based on a completely different video game, but it's the same franchise. It's the same universe. They're just, different looks, I think, for each character, and then there might be characters that were not present in the second Street Fighter video game that Storm Collectibles will be able to have. But still, they're in direct competition with somebody else that's making collectibles fairly similar to theirs at that 1/12 scale and at similar price points. I just don't feel like they're catching a break here. I think if they had to pay a little bit extra to have that exclusivity and only have themselves manufacture those figures, I think they should have, paid up a little bit extra. But in this particular case, it just feels like every avenue that they take, every IP that they take, is either way too obscure, or there's already somebody directly competing with them, and I just don't feel like that's a sustained business model. Now, they have picked up other video games that are either retro or are somewhat modern. I mean, you have, for example, Cyberpunk. They did manufacture 2 characters or 2 action figures based on the Cyberpunk universe. However, similarly to everything else, it's a bit obscure. I don't know how many people that are legitimately playing Cyberpunk are also action figure collectors. Not to mention they were on the pricier side. These weren't like readily available. And I think the more affordable character in the video game was like $35, and then the other one, which granted, it was more deluxe. It came with some cloth goods. It came with some extra accessories, better articulation, better sculpt work, things of that nature. But it was a $50 priced action figure, which is not something that you usually see from Jada Toys. They tried their hand at that, and unfortunately, well, at least from what I can see, it's still available everywhere else. I don't think it's selling out. It's not flying off of the shelves, which is another big problem because this is a modern game. The best case scenario for an action figure manufacturer is to pick up a game that's relevant, that's hitting, that's consistently, in the eyes of the consumer. And unfortunately, they weren't even able to capitalize on that. The other action figure line, or the other IP that they also picked up not too long ago, was the Mega Man universe, which, just to clarify, is one of my favorite video games growing up. I remember playing it on my Game Boy Advance and then my GameCube, and then if I'm not mistaken, was it also on the Sega Genesis or one of those consoles from way back in the day? But I absolutely loved it. Most of my memories come from the GameCube console, but still, I absolutely love the universe. But that's a very small fan base. I mean, those few people that actually play the video game, are all of them action figure collectors? Probably not. And there, you can only get so deep before people just completely start jumping off, especially considering that Jada Toys has already decided to raise their initial price point for Mega Man action figures. I think originally they were retailing for $24.99, which is already kind of a hefty price point at the time, because McFarlane was still producing figures at $22.99. There were still some wrestling figures at $22.99, and if I'm not mistaken, maybe it was around the same time when the Marvel Legends line was also $22.99. So they were slightly more expensive than other lines, but now at that $30 price point, are you really expecting that many people to go out of their way to pick up, like, like a Woodman, or, like, let's say an Iceman, although that one I think was part of the first wave, or an alternate version of Mega Man? I just don't know if there's enough support, enough of a demand for those type of action figures. And I will say, Jada Toys did kind of plan this out to a certain extent, at least from what I can tell, because they kind of whiffed what was happening with other manufacturers. They realized that, Hasbro was manufacturing the Gamerverse Marvel Legends action figures, which most of them are the Marvel vs. Capcom, or are from the Marvel vs. Capcom universe. And then you have SH not too long ago, which I think started doing some Marvel vs. Capcom action figures as well. So they kind of timed it perfectly to where a lot of the action figures that they're manufacturing fit in with other displays, right? Like, you want a Mega Man in there. Potentially you want all your Street Fighter roster next to your Marvel Legends action figure. So it kind of makes sense. And I think a lot of people are probably going to try to flesh out their displays as much as they possibly can, including Jada Toys, along with their Marvel Legends display, because they scale well with each other and they have similar proportions and things of that nature. But long term, I just don't see what they're going to do. I think eventually they're going to have to switch up their practices. Most people, initially knew them for making, like, die-cast vehicles, which they're very good at as well. I have seen a lot of their die-cast vehicles, and they do an absolutely phenomenal job. But in the long run, I think they're going to have to evolve and pick up bigger IPs, pick up video game franchises that are more relevant, or maybe a slightly bigger IP. I've already said this before. I know they're smaller, and so they may not be able to handle the distribution or the manufacturing of a really big franchise. But unfortunately, the way that I look at it, and I can only speak for myself, every time that I'm making my budget for the month and I'm trying to figure out what action figures and what waves, what universes and what manufacturers I'm really interested in, all of the IPs, or all of essentially the franchises that Jada Toys is working on right now, are all the way at the bottom. Like, I'm always going to prioritize other things that's like Marvel, whether it's Star Wars, whether it's DC. And then once I get to the bottom of the list, it's going to get to, maybe picking up a Scooby-Doo action figure here or there. I still have to flesh out my, Street Fighter universe, Mega Man. But I don't think that those are at the top of anybody's list. And that's unfortunate because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, they're probably one of the best toy manufacturers out there. But unfortunately, they rarely get an opportunity to fully showcase their potential. I mean, you go to your local Walmart as a perfect example. There isn't even a section for Jada Toys at the moment. And I know it's very difficult to get in there and, get a little section on the shelf because of Mattel and Hasbro and McFarlane. But I think if they play their cards right, they should be able to find a little section, maybe near the electronics section next to McFarlane, and display their action figures and really get their name out there. But unfortunately, with the franchises, with the IPs that they're working on at the moment, I think it's going to be very difficult to be able to draw the attention of potential new customers when a lot of their action figure waves just don't appeal to a wider audience. And I know a lot of people like to compare their situation to like NECA or Super 7 or some of those smaller action figure manufacturers, but I just think they're a level above those manufacturers. And so even though I completely understand the argument, they're small, they pick up, lesser known IPs without the bigger fan bases, they still manufacture top-notch collectibles right on par with Hasbro and McFarlane, and sometimes even some of the imported action figures that are coming in from overseas. They match up incredibly well against those. So I just feel like what they need to do is gain some notoriety, pick up an IP that people are like paying attention to at the moment, maybe a modern video game that just came out. I know they just announced at SGCC their newest Invincible action figure line, which I think those look like absolute bangers. That's relevant. People are really paying attention to the comic book series. They absolutely love the animated series. And so I do feel like there's a potential there to kind of piggyback off of that success and maybe formulate your own. But unfortunately, I think time is running out. People are going to start kind of pushing Jada Toys to the side. And as I said, it's a shame because they actually do manufacture some great collectibles, great action figures. They just don't get the respect, I think, for the most part. I mean, people do, from time to time give them top spots in their top action figures of the year, or, when they're unboxing and doing reviews, they actually give them praise. But unfortunately, there just isn't that consistency from the line either. It's not like you're getting an action figure, an entire wave like on a monthly basis. It seems like you may get a figure here or there every few months, and people tend to be kind of like tiny little goldfish. Like if something isn't in front of them consistently, they completely forget about them and they just move on to something, right? Sometimes you have a few extra bucks burning a hole in your pocket and you just want to buy action figures. And unfortunately, if you're not, at the forefront consistently, somebody that's really interested in some of your action figures might just, turn around and buy something from Hasbro because they're just bombarding them with different waves and different live streams and announcing new figures and throwing up new pre-orders. So I think it's very important for Jada Toys to kind of turn this around. As I said, maybe I'm just a buffoon. I could just be making all of this up and making too much out of nothing. But just from where I'm standing, I feel like they could do a lot better. And I do feel like they can match up against some of the best manufacturers out there. I just feel like they kind of need to dig deep, find something relevant, find something that people are interested in nowadays, instead of just kind of tugging on the nostalgia strings and just riding that little wave as far as it can take them. I think they have way more capabilities, and it's time that they truly showcase it. But look, this is just my personal opinion, my personal take. I'm not an insider. I don't know how well Jada Toys is doing. Maybe they're making a gajillion dollars and I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I'm just speaking from personal experience. I'm speaking about when I make my personal budget. It always feels like Jada Toys is all the way to the bottom. Not on purpose. It's just that a lot of the IPs, a lot of the franchises that they're working on are either something that isn't relevant to me, or they're just not consistently releasing action figures. And so sometimes you tend to focus on what's upcoming instead of, focusing on something that's like maybe a few months away. But as I said, I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say. Let me know down below in the comment section. What's your favorite Jada Toys line? Do you feel like they need to switch things up, or are you okay with this entire situation of getting an action figure from them like every 3 months? Or would you like to see more consistency? Let me know down below. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As I said, I have covered this particular topic on like at least 2 to 3 different occasions, but I did want to circle back around and just kind of give you my final thoughts on this entire situation, because it is pretty interesting. It's pretty fascinating, as I said, especially coming from somebody that's a huge fan of the line and the manufacturer as a whole. Stay tuned. Keep up to date with the channel. We are uploading on a daily basis. We absolutely love it. It is sometimes pretty fatiguing, but as I said, I enjoy the heck out of it. Also, make sure to stay tuned. I did promise we're going to do a giveaway, and that is upcoming. I just have to, figure out all of the finer details, but eventually we will get to that. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Stay safe out there. Make sure to enjoy the hobby, pose your action figures, play around with them, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thank you.